week, I'm going to be talking about physical and sexual abuse, specifically in adolescence. And this issue is very prevalent in our society today, even though we may not witness it in our everyday lives. However, reducing stigma around it and spreading awareness around this topic is really important, and I'm excited to get the opportunity to do this with you today for my presentation. So, first, I'm going to be talking about what physical and sexual abuse is and defining it, and then going on to the history of the problem, the causes of abuse, the impacts of abuse, and then some steps and solutions that we can take as a society to bring more awareness around this issue. So, physical abuse is defined as an intentional act or pattern of behavior where physical force is used to cause harm, injury, or pain to an adolescent, typically done by an authority figure or someone in a position of power. Sexual abuse is defined as a violation perpetrated by someone with power over somebody that is vulnerable. This can include physical, verbal, and emotional components, and some examples are rape, date rape, domestic violence, sexual assault, sexual harassment, incest, and sexual molestation. And then a little more specifically, child sexual abuse is the engagement of a child in sexual activities for which the child is developmentally unprepared for and can't give informed consent. And so some commonalities between these two is that often physical and sexual abuse is done by someone with power over someone that's vulnerable. So often this can be a parent or a relative or a close friend that is doing this to the victim. However, it doesn't necessarily, it isn't necessarily someone that the victim could know personally, but most often it usually is. And then anyone under the age of 18 can be greatly affected by this because they're minors, and so that includes babies, children, and adolescents are all greatly affected because they don't have fully developed brains, and especially for children, they're not fully aware of what consent means yet. So now into the history of the problem. This issue has a really long history, and while it can be difficult to assign an exact timeline, the abuse of young individuals has been documented across cultures for centuries. So, for instance, in the Roman state, from the 2nd to the 1st century BC until about 235 AD, paterfamilias, which referred to the oldest living male within a household, had absolute authority over the children. So often this was the father, and they had the power to determine whether a child would be sold into slavery, whether they live or die, whether they be abandoned by the family. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, child protection laws began to emerge more in Western states, and this marked a significant shift in how society viewed child abuse. However, these laws didn't stop the issue completely, unfortunately. It wasn't until 1974 when the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act was passed by Congress, and this is where states were required to establish reporting requirements. To continue in the 1980s and 90s, there was a significant turning point in the history of adolescent abuse because high-profile cases such as those involving abuse within religious institutions, specifically the Catholic Church, contributed to the increased public awareness and outrage, and a lot of legal actions led to the revelation of this sexual abuse within the church, and this scandal prompted legal reforms and also led to a greater focus on adolescent and child protection. And so while these issues of physical and sexual abuse have a long history, and unfortunately they're never going to be resolved completely, societal attitudes towards abuse have definitely evolved significantly, and changing social norms and attitudes have contributed to a much more open dialogue about adolescent abuse, and also has encouraged more victims to come forward. So there are quite a few different causes of abuse. Family problems and dysfunction can be a significant factor in physical and sexual abuse. This can include substance abuse, domestic violence, specifically parental mental health issues, and lack of healthy communication with the family. And so a lot of research has shown that parents that deal with mental illness or parents that have um, been affected by physical or sexual abuse in their past are more likely to mistreat their child. The cycle of violence, which I'll also be talking about later on, is another cause, and this refers to the fact that abuse and violence is a constant cycle that is hard to break, and those that suffer from abuse are more likely to inflict it later on. Power imbalances in relationships is another cause, especially when there's a significant age difference between the adolescent and the perpetrator. And also, the stigma around abuse can lead to an increased number of abuse, especially for male victims, because male victims are less likely to report incidents due to societal norms that may stigmatize them, and because they're less likely to report these, they're more likely to keep enduring the abuse. Um, so now on to the impact that abuse has on adolescents. So they're more prone to emotional and mental health issues, and this includes PTSD, depression, anxiety, anger, and aggression, lower self-esteem, sense of lower self-worth. They also have more difficulties with interpersonal relationships. Um, they often struggle more with substance abuse. Um, and overall, there's a lot of substance abuse issues, particularly when both the perpetrator and the victims are using drugs or alcohol, because this can just lead to more abusive situations, as substances can impair judgment and increase the risk of violent behavior. Research has shown that there's also an increase in suicidal ideation for adolescents that dealt with abuse, as well as an increase in illegal activity and also running away from home. And unfortunately, self-harm and eating disorders have also been reported to be linked to abuse among adolescents. And all these things are negatively impacting adolescents. I wanted to highlight the cycle of violence because this is both a cause and an impact on abuse. And so this suggests that individuals who endure abuse and mistreatment during their childhood are at a higher risk of both experiencing and perpetrating violence as they grow older. And this can be shown through the social learning theory, which, according to this theory, means that behaviors are acquired through observation. So this means that individuals who've been victims of abuse carry this into their adolescence, they carry into adulthood, and then they believe that aggression is a viable method for addressing conflicts. And so a lot of studies have shown that there's more of a likelihood um, that victims will become perpetrators of violence later on in their life because they've dealt with it for so long and it hasn't been treated, and they haven't been healed from this violence, unfortunately. So some steps and solutions that we can take in order to bring more awareness and help this issue. So overall, just awareness and education is really important, and it's important to get informed on this issue. And there are a lot more prevention programs for adolescents now that help them identify situations that may be dangerous and ways that they can protect themselves. Um, Appropriate training from the parents, media, and school educators are all really important because they all have an educational role and play a significant role in education. Um, and they're the ones that see these kids and these adolescents every single day. Um, it's also important to look for signs that victims are struggling, and these are things that everyone can do, even if even if you don't play an educational role. Um, So some signs that adolescents are struggling with abuse could include nightmares, could include sleep problems, sudden changes in mood, like if they're becoming more violent or they show more aggression, changes in eating, or also the refusal to be in a certain place or be alone with a particular person. Additionally, it's important that adolescents are taught about empowerment and ownership. So they should be taught that they have the right to say no to any behavior that they don't want, and we should be empowering children that they are allowed to create boundaries. It's also really important that adolescents know that they have access to support services. And this can be like online through a crisis hotline. This can be counseling, mental health sources, um, medical care. It's just really important that not only do they know that they have access to this care, but that it just exists for them. Um, and lastly, we can support research efforts that do lots of research on this topic to help better understand the root causes and the consequences and just bring more research and light onto this topic. And lastly, we can advocate for policy changes and to strengthen child protection laws. So all these things are different steps that we can do to bring more awareness and um, reduce the stigma around physical and sexual abuse that adolescents often deal with. And these are my sources.